Hello there, my name is Jason and I'm a penetration tester at Predatech. Today I wanted to talk to you about penetration testing, what it involves, who might need it and why it can be super beneficial in keeping businesses secure. So what exactly is a penetration test? Well, penetration testing, which is sometimes referred to as pen testing, is an authorised assessment of a business's security. And it basically involves using tools and techniques attackers would usually use to find and exploit vulnerabilities in a business's IT infrastructure. This can help us understand the actions that may be taken by an attacker if an attack were to actually occur, and this helps the business identify and prioritise weaknesses which can be addressed to reduce the risk and impact of future attacks. One thing to note is that penetration tests are conducted manually, and it's this manual element that separates a penetration test from a vulnerability scan. Vulnerability scans are automated and will only pick up the most basic vulnerabilities, whereas penetration testing brings a human element, and the tester will take it one step further and exploit these vulnerabilities to see just how an attacker might use them to their advantage. It basically allows for a more thorough test of a system's weaknesses than a vulnerability assessment could ever provide, and that's where the real value of penetration testing becomes clear. So why is testing important? Why should my business care? Well, if you look at the statistics, and by the way, this was published last year by Accenture, there was a 67% increase in security breaches from 2014 to 2019. That is a massive figure, and it's only going to increase year on year, unfortunately. This is why penetration testing should be considered no matter what kind of business you're in, because the vast majority of security breaches are preventable. However, many businesses leave it until it's too late. Attackers are going to be looking for the low-hanging fruit. They may look at your business and think, is this business worth attacking? Is the cost and effort worth the reward? If your systems have unpatched, out-of-date software and the attackers found a large set of breach credentials, or your systems are obviously misconfigured, then the attacker's going to start rubbing their hands together. So penetration testing is going to not only help you discover these issues, but then start looking at the fine details. What might an attacker, if they really want to cause some damage, what might they target? And what tools and techniques might they use to achieve this? It really helps a business to harden their systems in the case they become targeted by an attacker, and it will help you keep your customers, your stakeholders and their data secure. So a common question I'm often asked is, how do you know whether your business needs a penetration test? In all honesty, it really depends. In an ideal world, every business should be having a regular penetration test conducted. However, we don't live in an ideal world. Some businesses, especially smaller businesses, may not have a large security budget and will often opt for a cheaper alternative such as a vulnerability assessment. And this can be a really practical solution for smaller, low-risk companies. However, there may be other smaller companies that are at higher risk. They may be holding a lot of special category data or sensitive data where penalties could be severe if a breach were to occur. In this case, if a business were on a budget, they may want to commission a penetration test on a smaller section of their infrastructure. For example, maybe their web application is connected to a back-end database where a small lapse in code could result in a SQL injection attack. This could lead to the theft potentially of hundreds of customer records and cause major damage to a business's reputation. So it makes sense to place your focus here, as this is where there could be the greatest impact. Many businesses may have a regulatory obligation for compliance frameworks such as PCI DSS when holding payment card data, for example. So for some companies, they may be required to undertake regular penetration testing. For other businesses, I think they just need to sit down and be honest with themselves. How great is the risk? How badly would a security breach impact your business? What is the likelihood? My biggest tip, I think, is if you're not sure, then ask a security firm. I'm sure most will give you a free consultation, and the worst that could happen is that maybe you'll leave the call understanding a bit more about your risk profile. At the end of the day, what have you got to lose? So yeah, at the end of the day, you've got to ask yourself, what is my risk and can I accept this risk? I mean, in a lot of cases, the cost of a penetration test will be a drop in the ocean compared to the cost of a successful cyber attack. So let's talk about some of the common types of testing. We have external and internal network testing, web application testing, and social engineering, which test the people side of your business. For example, how susceptible they are to phishing attacks. Not all these types of testing may be applicable to your business. Often they all might, but the test will help tease out what you need. Or maybe you already have an idea of what you might need. So let's talk about all of these in a little bit more detail to understand what they might involve. So external network testing involves testing IP addresses that face the internet. This type of testing is for businesses that either have customers or staff connected to on-site and private cloud servers and applications. If you have no services you host that are accessible via the internet, this type of pen test most of the time won't apply to you. So what does an external network pen test entail? Well, we'll start by conducting open source intelligence gathering, which is how all engagements will usually begin. We will then do a port scan to understand what ports are open and what services may be running on these ports. Some of the other things we may do include vulnerability scans. We may try credential stuffing using breach credentials if in scope, password spraying and brute force attacks. It really will depend on the client's network and the ports they have open. During this test, we're really looking to exploit vulnerabilities that could be used by attackers and potentially gain access to your internal network. We tend to not start analysing any web applications themselves in this type of testing, even though it may be served on one of the ports. Web application testing follows a bit of a different approach, as we're mainly focusing on a higher layer on the TCP/IP stack, although we usually test the web server ports as well at some point during the pen test. Moving on to internal network testing now. This type of testing involves a private part of your network. So this includes all your internal IP addresses that are not directly accessible via the internet, and some businesses might even have a private network, which isn't unrealistic for certain SMEs, especially since the pandemic began. A lot of companies are now reliant on software as a service models instead. If you do have a private internal network, you may start to think about internal testing, and internal testing involves some overlap with the techniques used in external testing. However, with internal testing there are some additional things to bear in mind. On internal networks you may have access to Active Directory, internal servers used by staff, and more interesting services such as SMB. This can give testers a much wider attack surface to play with. Internal network testing is less about preventing an attack, as the attackers already breached your external defences. It's more about making your internal infrastructure more resilient, which can help to slow potential attackers down and make them use noisier techniques. And when they use noisier techniques, they're often more easy to detect. You want to be secure in your data, even in the event you have a rogue employee, for example, who wants to do some damage on your network. Internal network testing helps identify weaknesses and allow you to address this. Most private networks make silly mistakes that can lead to full domain compromise in a matter of minutes, and it is scary just how easy it is sometimes. And that's basically why internal testing shouldn't be overlooked. So on to web application testing now, and typically web applications are a very ripe target for attackers, and this is because of the valuable data and the rich functionality present in most applications. This often offers a large attack surfaces for attackers to utilise. Some oversights in web application code can lead to attacks on your customers, compromised databases, and even gaining access to the web server itself. Testing web applications usually involves following the methodology set out by the Open Web Application Security Project, or OWASP for short. OWASP publishes both a list of top 10 web vulnerabilities and the Web Standard Testing Guide. The Web Standard Testing Guide is a comprehensive methodology that guides testers through testing all different aspects of the web, including testing of authentication mechanisms, session management, input validation, including well-known attacks like SQL injection and cross-site scripting. So most businesses will have at least a website. If the website is pretty basic, so maybe mostly static, then you'll probably get away with just running a vulnerability scan. However, if you have one or several web applications which have more functionality, like user logins and other workflows, then you might want to consider this type of testing. So moving on to social engineering now, and social engineering in my eyes is the act of using deception to make an individual perform an action or divulge information. Nowadays, social engineering is probably one of the biggest threats to your business, with business email compromise and more sophisticated phishing attacks constantly on the rise. And the barrier of entry for these attacks is just ridiculously low, and there's just so many successful attacks occurring nowadays. Testing may involve some kind of research, where a single individual is targeted specifically, or maybe you just want to see how your staff reacts to a standard phishing attack. A phishing simulation will help you understand how aware your staff are, because at the end of the day, staff are usually the chink in the armour for even the most technically secure business. This may help you when you come round to developing staff training and awareness materials. So now we have the different types of testing out of the way. There are generally 3 ways to approach the testing, and these approaches determine how much the tester knows about the systems going into the engagement. Now every firm has a different definition of these 3 approaches, so bear that in mind as we go through them. And so the first type of approach is black box testing. Now this type of testing is where the tester knows nothing or very little about how your systems function internally. So this approach is most realistic in terms of simulating an attack. However, this approach often takes more time and often doesn't allow the tester to discover all vulnerabilities due to restrictions in system visibility. A white box test, on the other hand, will involve the tester having intimate knowledge of how your internal systems function. This can include credentials, network topologies, and application code, basically anything that the tester might need to know going into the engagement. However, this approach also has some limitations, and one of those is that it isn't very realistic, and so it isn't always the most effective way of testing. We tend to conduct engagements with an approach that falls somewhere between the two, and this is known as grey box testing. So for some parts of the test, we may need credentials, for example testing roles in web applications, but we also want to go into the engagement with a fresh set of eyes wherever possible. We think this gives our clients a good balance, and in our eyes is the most effective way of testing. So let's quickly run through how testing works in practice. This might give you an idea of the high-level methodology generally used when testing. So we begin with the pre-engagement. This is where the testing firm will sit down with you to determine what's in scope and out of scope for testing. This basically agrees what will be tested. Once you sign the contract, you usually discuss the rules of engagement, so this is the specifics of how you want the testing to be performed. This will include the start date of the test, the end date, and the general logistics of the engagement to understand what is allowed and what isn't. Once agreed, there will be a kick-off call, usually before the engagement begins, to make sure everything is ready for testing to commence. Now the intelligence gathering will begin. The tester will start looking for information that may help them understand your business, so maybe IT setup may include usernames, breach credentials, subdomains. They may fingerprint what software and extensions you're running on your web server, emails and phone numbers, basically all the information they can on your business. The next stage is where active reconnaissance begins. This is the stage where the tester will start scanning and prodding the ports or application they're testing, and they would be using the information gathered in the previous steps to help guide their enumeration. All the data gathered so far is then analysed by the tester to decide what to prioritise. They'll look for any vulnerabilities and put together what they're going to try and exploit. The tester will then try and exploit these vulnerabilities to see what an attacker might be able to achieve. For example, maybe the attacker might exploit a vulnerability that allows them to obtain a list of usernames for a given web application. In all honesty, the vulnerability analysis and exploitation stages are usually conducted simultaneously. I've just separated it here to make it a bit more digestible. All the information and access gathered during the exploitation phase is then fed back into the active reconnaissance phase. The cycle then begins again, constantly gaining more and more information and access. At the same time, all of these findings are being written up into a report for the client. In the report, the tester will explain the vulnerabilities found and the recommendations on how to remediate these weaknesses. And the client then receives this report and can implement these recommendations. Sometime after the engagement, the tester will usually retest the specific vulnerabilities in the report to validate that they've been remediated successfully. And that's basically it in a nutshell. Obviously, this is a very simplified explanation of the stages, and it isn't always this straightforward, but hopefully it gives you an idea of what you might expect. So what if you're looking for a pen test? How do you know you're choosing a partner who will be able to deliver? Well, I think 9 times out of 10 it really comes down to the tester themselves. You want to either be looking for testers with hands-on experience, or maybe they have industry recognised certifications such as the OSCP or the GAC Pen offered by SANS, just something to show that they have some hands-on training. In the UK, a lot of firms will want their testers to be CREST certified, where the qualification has both a written and a practical element. If a tester doesn't have any certifications, that's not always a bad thing. I know many testers who are amazing security professionals and they have no certifications at all. So it's more of an indicator than a hard truth. Something else you may want to ask the firm is how they approach testing. Do they probe and ask the right questions to determine the scope and rules of engagement? A strong firm will ask a range of questions to understand the systems that will be tested. You also want to know if retesting is included in the price, which will validate that the changes you make have actually fixed the vulnerabilities after the engagement. And it's the age-old saying that if the price looks too good to be true, it usually is. The last thing you want to do is pay for a penetration test and receive a vulnerability scan, and it's more common than you might think. You want to find a firm that will take the time it needs to do a good job. Often firms will try and shorten the engagement and keep the cost the same. A penetration test will take at the very least a week in most cases, and if you've got a lot to test, then this could easily span to a few weeks to give a good pen test. So that's really it from me. I hope this has given you a good idea of what penetration testing is and what it involves. Give us a thumbs up if you found this video useful, and feel free to get in touch if you'd like to discuss more around your business and what might be the best solution for you. Until next time, my name is Jason and I wish you all a great day. Goodbye.